The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882, and it smelled of lavender and money, and Lillian Sullivan knew the moment she broke the wax seal that it was going to change everything. She stood in the pale light of her aunt's parlor in Boston, the kind of room that had always felt like a museum to her, full of polished silver and velvet curtains and the particular silence of wealth, and she read the words her uncle had written 3 times before she allowed herself to understand them. He was offering her a position, not just a position, a life. She would become the administrative secretary for the Sullivan family's textile business, a title that carried with it a handsome salary, a furnished apartment on Beacon Street, a social standing that most women her age could only dream of, and the permanent, unspoken condition that she would remain precisely where she was, doing precisely what she was told for the rest of her foreseeable years. It was generous. Lillian knew that. Her aunt had poured tea and watched her read with that particular expression of carefully arranged hope, and when Lillian finally looked up, her aunt had said, softly and with genuine affection, that it was a wonderful opportunity for a woman of her situation. A woman of her situation. Lillian had turned the phrase over in her mind like a stone in a river, feeling its smooth, worn-down edges. 24 years old, educated, capable, no husband, no inheritance. Her father, Thomas Sullivan, had gone west to New Mexico Territory in 1878 with a dream of cattle ranching in the Pecos Valley, and he had died of fever 2 years later without having written a will or accumulated much beyond the land itself. 60 acres of hard ground outside a small town called Cayama Crossing, a deed that now sat in a leather satchel under Lillian's bed waiting to be either sold or used. Her aunt and uncle had been clear about their preference. Sell the land, take the position, remain in Boston, forget the West. It was no place for a woman alone. It was all dust and danger and the kind of men who solved disagreements with firearms. Lillian had nodded at all of this with the careful composure of someone who had not yet made up her mind, and then she had gone to her room and opened her father's last letter and read it for the 100th time. He had written about the sunsets. He had written about the way the light turned the red clay hills into something that looked like fire. He had written about the sound of the wind through the canyon grass at night, and the particular smell of rain on dry earth, and how a person could stand out on 60 acres of open land and feel something that Boston, with all its refinement and certainty, had never once offered him, which was the simple and overwhelming sensation of being completely, absolutely free. Lillian had folded the letter and placed it back in its envelope and began packing her trunk. The journey from Boston to New Mexico Territory in the spring of 1882 was not a romantic undertaking. It was 5 days by rail as far as the southern trunk lines would carry her, a cramped and coal-dusted experience that left her hair smelling of smoke and her back aching in ways she had not thought possible, followed by a 2-day stage ride into the high desert that tested every last assumption she had made about her own resilience. The stagecoach was a lurching, groaning thing that smelled of leather and other people's travel, and the road, if it could be called a road, was little more than 2 tracks worn into the earth by repeated wagon passage, and by the second afternoon Lillian's bones had acquired a personal acquaintance with every rock the wheels encountered. She arrived in Cayama Crossing on a Wednesday afternoon in late April with a trunk, a leather satchel, and $43 in a small purse sewn into the inside of her traveling coat. The town was smaller than she had imagined. A main street of maybe 10 buildings, some of them wood-framed, some of them adobe, a general store and a livery stable, and a building that served simultaneously as the post office and the land registry office, a saloon with a faded painted sign, a church at the far end of the street that had once been white and had since been persuaded toward a dusty beige by the wind. There were horses at the hitching posts and men in broad-brimmed hats moving in and out of the shade of covered walkways, and the air was hot and dry and carried the smell of horses and pine, and something else beneath it all. Something mineral and ancient. The smell of the earth itself, in a place where the earth had not been buried under cobblestone and ambition. Lillian stepped down from the stagecoach and immediately felt the weight of eyes on her, which was the natural consequence of being a woman in a good traveling coat, arriving alone in a town that had perhaps 80 permanent residents. She straightened her back, adjusted the brim of her hat, and went to retrieve her trunk. The man at the land registry office was named Mr. Farwell, a thin, precise person of about 60 who wore spectacles and spoke with the clipped efficiency of someone who had lived in small places too long to waste words on decoration. He reviewed her deed and her father's documentation with methodical care, confirmed that the 60 acres were indeed her legal inheritance, and provided her with a hand-drawn map and the names of 2 people she might want to speak with before attempting to occupy the property. The first was a woman named Mrs. Holcomb, who ran the town's only boarding house and who could provide short-term accommodation. The second was a man named Nathan Carson, who had been working a neighboring parcel for the past 2 years and who, according to Mr. Farwell, knew the Sullivan land better than anyone currently living, as he had been keeping an eye on it out of what he described as neighborly concern, and what Mr. Farwell described, with the subtle diplomacy of a small-town official, as a situation that would need some sorting out. Lillian did not yet know what any of that meant. She thanked Mr. Farwell and went to find Mrs. Holcomb. Mrs. Holcomb was a broad-shouldered woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair and brown eyes that assessed Lillian in approximately 4 seconds and arrived at a verdict of cautious approval. She had a room available. She provided dinner, and over a meal of beans and salt pork and cornbread that Lillian ate with genuine hunger, having had very little during the stage ride, she explained the situation regarding Nathan Carson. The Sullivan property had been left untended after Thomas Sullivan's death. The irrigation channels her father had dug had begun to collapse. The small outbuilding had partially caved in under a hard winter. The 60 acres were in the slow process of returning to the desert from which they had been briefly coaxed. Nathan Carson, who worked the adjacent 80 acres and ran a small but functional cattle and farming operation, had taken to maintaining the boundary fences and keeping the irrigation channels from entirely dissolving, not because anyone had asked him to, but because he was, as Mrs. Holcomb put it with the particular fondness of someone who had known a person for years, the kind of stubborn and quietly decent man who could not watch something good fall apart without doing something about it. Even when it wasn't strictly his business to do so, there was a complication, however. And the complication was that Nathan Carson had, at some point in the last year, been offered the opportunity to purchase the Sullivan land outright through the county land office, which had the authority to sell abandoned property after a certain period under territorial law. He had not purchased it. He had instead informed Mr. Farwell that the land had a legitimate heir who would eventually come to claim it, and he had produced, from some fold in his apparently bottomless sense of principle, a letter that Thomas Sullivan had written to him in 1879, mentioning his daughter Lillian by name and expressing the hope that she might one day come west. Lillian had set down her spoon at that point in the story and looked at Mrs. Holcomb with an expression she could not quite name. "He kept my father's land from being sold," she said. "He did," Mrs. Holcomb confirmed, "and he's kept it from falling apart more or less for 2 years. Which means you've got some things to thank him for and some things to figure out with him, and I expect you'll be doing both sooner rather than later." She met Nathan Carson the following morning. She had walked out to the Sullivan property at dawn, map in hand, wearing her most practical boots and a plain cotton dress she had purchased the previous evening from the general store, because she had owned nothing sensible enough for red clay terrain. The land was further from town than she had expected, a 20-minute walk down a road that was more suggestion than infrastructure, and when she finally reached the old boundary fence her father had described in his letters, She stood for a long moment and simply looked at it. It was rough country. She would not pretend otherwise. The land was dry and rocky, the grasses thin and silvery in the early light, the soil a deep rust color that she could already feel coating the hem of her dress. There was a line of cottonwood trees along a drainage channel that suggested water somewhere below the surface, and the blue-purple shadow of the mesa to the west gave the whole landscape a grandeur that was nothing like the gentle greens of New England, but was in its own way entirely magnificent. She could see why her father had loved it. She was standing at the broken gate, trying to decide what the land needed first, when she heard the creak of a wagon. He came from the north, following a track along the fence line she had not noticed, a flatbed wagon pulled by a bay horse that moved with the unhurried ease of a well-kept animal. The man handling the reins was perhaps 28 or 29, broad-shouldered in the way of men who have built their bodies through actual work rather than ambition, with dark hair under a worn brown hat, and a face that the sun had treated with the frank thoroughness it reserved for people who spent their lives outdoors. He wore a collarless shirt and canvas trousers and boots that had clearly walked a great many miles of the same hard ground she was standing on. He pulled the wagon to a stop when he saw her and looked at her for a moment with a direct, unguarded attention that was not impolite, but was also not the careful social performance she was accustomed to receiving from men in Boston. "You'd be Lillian Sullivan," he said. It was not a question. "I would be," she said. "And you're Nathan Carson." He climbed down from the wagon with the easy efficiency of someone for whom physical movement was simply the medium of daily life, and he walked toward her and extended a hand, and she shook it, and his grip was firm and warm and slightly rough, the hand of a man who worked with it constantly. "Your father talked about you," he said. "Told me you were educated and stubborn. Meant it as a compliment, I think." "I'll take it as one," she said. "Mr. Farwell tells me I have you to thank for the fact that this land still belongs to me." Nathan Carson looked at the land in question and then back at her, and something moved across his face that she would later identify as a complicated mixture of relief, and though she did not recognize it yet, a kind of carefully restrained feeling that had been waiting a long time for somewhere to land. "Your father was a good man," he said. "Seemed wrong to let his work disappear." They stood there in the early morning light with 60 acres of complicated possibility between them, and Lillian Sullivan looked at the hard ground and the broken fence and the line of cottonwood trees and felt something she had not expected to feel, which was not dread or regret, or the particular variety of polite suffering she had been braced for, but rather the sudden, certain, slightly terrifying sensation of having arrived precisely where she was supposed to be. She did not say that aloud. She said, "Tell me what it needs," and Nathan Carson looked at her with a new expression that contained, she thought, the beginning of respect, and he said, "More than a morning's conversation." "Do you have time?" And she said, "I have the rest of my life," and neither of them fully understood yet how literally she meant that. The first 2 weeks were largely practical. Lillian took up her residence in Mrs. Holcomb's boarding house, which was comfortable enough and provided the benefit of Mrs. Holcomb's considerable knowledge of the territory and its people, and spent her days at the Sullivan property learning what she had and what she needed, and how much money the two things were likely to require to bridge the distance between them. Nathan came every day. Not because she had asked him to, exactly, but because they had fallen into an easy working arrangement that neither of them formally acknowledged. He would arrive at the Sullivan land in the mid-morning after completing his own earlier chores, and they would spend several hours assessing and planning, and occasionally beginning actual work. And he would explain the particularities of desert agriculture, and she would listen with a focus and intelligence that he found, she could tell, somewhat unexpected, and then she would ask questions that demonstrated she had been listening, and he would modify his explanations accordingly. He was not a man given to unnecessary speech. He spoke when he had something to say and was comfortably silent when he did not, which Lillian found deeply restoring after years of Boston parlor conversation, which had operated on the principle that silence was a social failure requiring immediate remedy. She began to notice that she could sit with Nathan Carson for 10 or 20 minutes without either of them speaking, and feel not the awkwardness of social failure, but rather the pleasant weight of shared occupation, two people thinking in parallel about the same patch of difficult earth. The irrigation channel was the most urgent problem. Her father had diverted water from a seasonal creek that ran along the eastern boundary of the property, and the diversion works had been deteriorating for 2 years. Nathan had kept them from completely collapsing, but they needed to be properly rebuilt. On the 3rd day of the 2nd week, they worked side by side in the ditch for most of the afternoon, Lillian in a borrowed work apron and her plain cotton dress, moving adobe bricks and setting them in the position Nathan directed. And by the end of the afternoon, the main channel was sound enough that water moved through it in a thin but functional line, and they sat on the bank in the late sun, and Lillian's arms ached in a way that felt like an accomplishment. And Nathan looked at the water moving and said, "Your father would have liked this," and she felt the sting of tears she did not allow to fall. "He would have been insufferably pleased with himself," she said instead, and Nathan laughed, a genuine and unguarded sound that she had not heard from him before, and she filed it somewhere in her memory without examining why. She had written to her aunt and uncle, of course. She had written them a careful letter explaining that she had arrived safely and that the property had potential and that she was not, as they had feared, in immediate peril. Her aunt had written back by return mail, which given the distance meant the response arrived 3 weeks later, and it had been loving and worried, and it had reiterated, gently but clearly, that the position in Boston was still available, that the apartment on Beacon Street was still furnished and waiting, that it was not too late to make the sensible choice. Her uncle had appended a postscript that was less gentle and more direct, suggesting that 60 acres of New Mexico dirt was not a viable future for a woman of her education, and that she was being romantic about her father's legacy in a way that would cost her. Lillian read both letters twice, and then put them in her satchel and went back to the irrigation channel. By the end of May, she had hired a local laborer named Hector Vasquez, a quiet and capable man in his 40s who had been farming in the territory for 20 years, and who knew the land with the deep familiarity of someone who had fought it and made peace with it and come to a mutual respect. And with his help, the first plantings went into the ground beans and squash, and a small section of corn, modest beginnings but real ones. The outbuilding had been repaired enough to store tools and seed. The fence was largely sound. There was a great deal still to do, but the land was beginning to respond, and Lillian, who was developing new calluses on her hands and a tan line on her forearms, and a confidence in her own body that Boston had never had occasion to develop, felt the shape of something possible taking form. Nathan had begun to stay later in the evenings. It started practically enough. They would review what had been done and plan the next day while the light lasted, sharing a meal sometimes at Mrs. Holcomb's table if the work had run long. But the practical justification gradually gave way to something less easy to justify, which was simply that neither of them wanted the day to end. They talked about the land, yes, and about crops and water and fencing and the particular stubbornness of this piece of desert earth. But they also talked about other things, about Boston and the particular texture of a world where every surface was covered and nothing was left raw. About Nathan's family, who had homesteaded in Texas when he was a child, his father a hard man with good instincts who had worked himself into an early grave, and his mother a woman of remarkable endurance who had eventually remarried and moved to Colorado, leaving Nathan to make his own way at 21, which he had done with the methodical determination of someone who had been watching adults do difficult things since childhood and had simply paid attention. He was 28. She knew this by now, and she also knew that he had come to New Mexico territory 4 years ago, because a man he'd worked cattle with on a drive from Texas had described the land in terms that reminded him of what his father had always hoped to find, and he had saved his money and bought his 80 acres outright and spent the last 4 years turning raw desert into something that actually worked. And he was, by the modest standards of the territory, doing reasonably well. She asked him once, on a June evening when they were sitting on the repaired porch of what had been her father's small adobe house. She had moved from Mrs. Holcomb's into the house at the beginning of June once the roof had been made sound enough, whether he had ever regretted leaving Texas. He was quiet for a long time, looking at the way the mesa turned colors in the late light, moving through orange to deep red to a purple so saturated it looked painted. "I regretted leaving my mother," he said finally. "I don't regret the choice. Do you ever miss having someone?" She asked and immediately felt the recklessness of the question and tried to walk it back. "I mean family nearby, I suppose." But Nathan had turned to look at her with that direct, uncalculating attention that she was by now thoroughly accustomed to and still not immune to, and he said, quietly, "I've missed things I didn't know I was missing until recently." And then he looked back at the mesa and they sat in the gathering dark without speaking for a long time, and the silence was not empty but full, the way silences can be when two people are thinking the same unspoken thing. There was a social event in Kiama Crossing in the 3rd week of June that altered the terms between them in a way that could not be unaltered. The town held a summer gathering in the cleared space behind the church, a potluck supper and music and dancing, the kind of occasion that a small and isolated community invents out of the sheer human need for collective celebration. Mrs. Holcomb had told Lillian about it with a particular look that said she expected Lillian to attend, and also expected that she would not be attending alone. Nathan had mentioned it twice in passing with the studied casualness of a man who is not being casual. He arrived at her door at 6 in the evening wearing a clean shirt and a jacket that looked like it had been carefully brushed, and his hair was combed, and he held his hat in his hands with a formality that was touching in its transparency. She had worn her best dress, the deep green one she had packed in Boston with no particular occasion in mind, and which she now felt, standing in the doorway of a small adobe house in the New Mexico desert, was possibly the best decision she had ever made, if the expression on Nathan Carson's face was any measure. He said, "You look very fine, Miss Sullivan," and his voice was a little rough around the edges, and she felt something warm move through her that she acknowledged, privately and without any further prevarication, as love. Not the beginning of love, not the possibility of love, but the actual thing, already fully formed and simply waiting to be named. "You look very fine yourself, Mr. Carson," she said, and held out her arm, and he offered his elbow, and they walked into town in the warm June evening with the desert smelling of sage and cooling dust, and the last of the light turning everything gold. The evening was everything a summer gathering in a small western town could be expected to be, full of noise and laughter, and the smell of food, and the particular music of a fiddle and a guitar, played with enthusiasm, if not always perfect precision. There were children running between the legs of adults and old men playing cards at a table set against the church wall, and young women in bright dresses, moving through the lantern light, with the self-conscious grace of people who did not often have occasion to dress up. Lillian knew most of the town's inhabitants by now. She had met them in the course of daily life in the way that was inevitable in a community of 80 people, and she was received with the particular warmth of a small community that has decided to accept someone. And Nathan stayed by her side, not with the possessive architecture of a man marking territory, but with the easy, natural closeness of someone who simply wants to be where the other person is. He brought her food and introduced her to people she had not yet met, and once, when a slightly drunk man from a nearby ranch made a comment about her that was more admiring than appropriate, Nathan had placed himself in the conversation with a quiet and absolute firmness that resolved the situation without drama and left the man in question sheepish and departing. "Thank you," she said when they were alone again. "It was nothing," he said. "It wasn't nothing," she said, and he looked at her and did not argue. They danced. It was not something either of them had planned precisely, but the music changed to a slower air, and someone nearby said something encouraging, and Nathan had held out his hand, and she had taken it, and they moved through the simple steps of a dance that required them to be close, and she was aware of the warmth of his hand at her waist and the steadiness of him, and the way he was looking at her, as though she were the only fixed point in the whole turning world. "I need to tell you something," he said, as the music continued. "Tell me," she said. "When Farwell told me 2 years ago that the land could be sold," he said, keeping his voice low, "I blocked it because of what your father had said about you. But somewhere in the last 2 months I've had to be honest with myself about the fact that I had other reasons too, reasons I couldn't have named then because I hadn't met you yet." He paused, and she could feel the tension in him, the particular tension of a person saying something real rather than something practiced. "I'm not good at saying things finely," he said, "but I'm good at saying them truly. I think I'm falling in love with you, Lillian. And I know you came here for your land and your father's memory and nothing to do with me, and I'm not asking you for anything. I just needed you to know." She stopped dancing. They stood in the middle of the gathered crowd, and she looked at him, at this man who had preserved her inheritance out of loyalty to a dead stranger, who had come every morning to help her build something real, who had eaten dinner at her table and talked about Texas and looked at sunsets and laughed with genuine warmth and been exactly, entirely, unaffectedly himself. And she said, "Nathan, you absolute fool. I've been in love with you since the irrigation channel." He stared at her. "The irrigation channel?" He said. "The second week," she said, "when you showed me how to set the adobe bricks. You put your hand over mine to show me the right angle, and you were so careful about it, like you were handling something important." She paused. "I think that was the moment." He looked at her with an expression of such undisguised joy that it made her chest ache with the fullness of it. And he said, "Well," and then he said nothing else, because she had reached up and pressed her hand to his jaw and he had covered it with his own. And they stood there in the lantern light with the fiddle music curling around them and the whole small, wonderful world of Kiama Crossing going about its cheerful business around them. And it was perfect, and it was real, and it was entirely and completely theirs. The months that followed were a season of becoming farmers, becoming partners in the practical sense, and becoming something more in the private tender sense that moved between them with increasing warmth and certainty as the summer burned toward autumn. There were no grand gestures, no elaborate declarations. What they had instead was the daily intimacy of working the same land, of making decisions together that carried real consequence, of knowing each other in the way that people who share difficult work come to know each other, which is deep and unsentimental and more durable than almost any other kind. Nathan did not crowd her. He understood instinctively, or had perhaps learned from some combination of experience and careful attention, that Lillian Sullivan was not a woman who would want a man to take over. She had come west alone and built something from near nothing with her own hands, and whatever they built together would have to be genuinely together, and he honored that in ways both practical and personal. He asked her opinion and meant it. He disagreed with her sometimes, which she found she appreciated more than agreement, because a man who only agreed was a man who was not really listening. He told her when he thought she was pushing the land harder than it could bear, and she told him when she thought he was being overly cautious, and they negotiated these disagreements with the directness of two people who respected each other too much for polite evasion. In August, a letter arrived from Boston that was different from the previous ones. Her uncle had written not with gentle encouragement but with a kind of controlled firmness, informing her that the offer had a time limit, that if she had not accepted it by the autumn equinox, it would be withdrawn and offered to someone else, and that while he understood her attachment to her father's memory, he did not intend to hold a position open indefinitely for someone who had chosen, in his words, a life of dust and hard ground over a life of promise and comfort. Lillian read the letter at the kitchen table in the adobe house that was becoming more hers with every week. The walls now hung with a few small things she had brought from Boston, a small watercolor of the Massachusetts coast and her father's compass, which she kept in a place of honor above the window that looked east. Nathan was there. He was often there in the evenings now, and she handed him the letter without comment and watched him read it. When he finished, he set it down and was quiet for a moment, and then he looked at her with the directness that was so entirely himself. "Is there any part of you that wants to go back?" he asked, not accusatory, not afraid. Simply asking the true question because he was a man who asked true questions. Lillian looked around the room, at the packed clay walls and the low roof and the window with its view of the mesa going purple in the evening. At the table where they had eaten 100 meals and talked about water tables and seed varieties in Texas and Boston and everything in between. At her own hands, which were no longer the smooth hands of a Boston parlor, but the hands of a woman who had been working real ground. "No," she said, "not any part. I know what I want. I want this. I want the land and the work," and she paused for a moment, finding the rest of the words. "And I want the life I'm building here. With you." Nathan reached across the table and covered her hands with his and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying. She wrote back to her uncle that week. The letter was not unkind. She expressed her genuine gratitude for his care and his offer and the generosity behind both. She told him she hoped he would understand, and she told him she suspected he might not. And she told him that she was well and the land was producing, and that she was, despite the dust and the hard ground and the distance from everything she had been raised to expect, deeply and entirely happy. She did not ask him to approve. She simply told him the truth, which was the most respectful thing she could offer. Her aunt wrote back a month later with a letter that surprised her. Short and uncharacteristically plain for a woman who usually composed with elaborate care. It said, "Your father would have been proud of you. I believe I am too, though your uncle requires more time. Take good care of yourself, Lillian. Tell me about the sunsets." Lillian had taken the letter outside and read it in the late afternoon light, standing on the hard clay of her own property, and felt the particular relief of a knot loosening. September brought the first harvest, modest but real beans and squash, and a small yield of corn, enough to confirm that the land could produce if properly managed, enough to give her the numbers she needed to plan the following spring more aggressively. Hector Vasquez had become a permanent fixture, bringing his wife Alina with him occasionally, a warm and practical woman who taught Lillian the particular art of preserving food in the desert climate with a generosity of knowledge that felt like friendship, and in time became exactly that. Nathan had suggested, carefully, in the middle of October, that there were practical efficiencies to be considered regarding the management of their two adjacent properties, and Lillian had looked at him over the supper table with a perfectly level expression and said that she assumed he was working up to something and he might as well say it directly. He had put down his fork and looked at her and said, "I would very much like to marry you, Lillian Sullivan, if you'll have me." She had been waiting, she realized, for this with a patience she had not quite acknowledged to herself. She had known since June that it was coming, in the same way that you know a storm is coming when the air changes quality, and she had been sitting with the knowledge of her own answer for months, turning it over not because she doubted it but because it was large and she wanted to understand all its edges. "Yes," she said. "I'll have you, Nathan Carson." She paused. "It's about time." He laughed, that real and unguarded laugh she had been filing in her memory since June, and reached across the table, and the candle between them had guttered in a draught from the window and filled the room with the smell of warm wax, and outside the desert night was absolute and full of stars. They married in November, in the Kayama Crossing Church that had been talked into white again by the combined effort of several townspeople inspired by the occasion. It was a small wedding because the community was small, but it was attended by most of the town's 80 souls, which, given that they had all dressed in their best clothes, gave the little church the feeling of a much grander event. Mrs. Holcomb cried, which she denied with vigor for years afterward. Hector Vasquez and Elena sat in the front row, and Elena wore a shawl embroidered with flowers so bright they looked like they had been borrowed from some more colorful season. The minister, a man named Reverend Pratt who had come to the territory from Ohio and had never entirely recovered from the discovery that the landscape was beautiful rather than threatening, performed the ceremony with a warmth and brevity that Lillian appreciated. She wore the green dress from the summer gathering because she had decided it was the dress she had first been seen in by Nathan Carson in a way that mattered, and it seemed right. She carried a small bunch of late-blooming desert flowers that Elena had gathered, yellow and rust and deep orange against the green of the dress. Nathan wore his best jacket and a clean white shirt and stood at the altar with the straight and simple bearing of a man who was absolutely certain of what he was doing. When Reverend Pratt asked if she took this man, she said, "I do," with a clarity and volume that made someone near the back laugh softly, which was the right response. When Nathan slid the ring onto her finger, a simple silver band that he had ordered from a jeweler in Santa Fe, and which had arrived only 2 days before the wedding, leaving him in a state of private anxiety that he had managed to conceal from everyone except possibly Mrs. Holcomb, his hands were entirely steady. She noticed that. She loved him for it. The reception was in the cleared space behind the church where they had danced in June, and the fiddle player from the summer gathering came back, and there was food enough for twice the number of people present, and the evening was cold and clear, and the stars over the mesa were so thick and bright they looked like a second landscape, and Nathan and Lillian Carson danced in the cold air with their breath making small clouds between them and her head against his shoulder and his arms around her. And around them, Kayama Crossing celebrated with the particular joy that small communities reserve for moments when something genuinely good happens within them. Winter on 60 acres of New Mexico desert had its own demands and its own silences, and Lillian found, somewhat to her surprise, that she loved it. The work slowed but did not stop. There was always something to repair, to plan, to prepare, and the days had a different rhythm, shorter and quieter and turned inward, and she and Nathan filled that inwardness with conversation and reading and the kind of comfortable physical proximity that is the particular gift of winter in a small, warm house. They combined the management of the two properties under a single working plan, not merging the deeds. Lillian kept her 60 acres in her name, which Nathan had suggested and she had appreciated, but running them as a single operation, splitting the work according to ability and availability and the season's requirements. She began keeping records. She had always been good with numbers, a fact that had made the Boston textile position appeal to her uncle on practical grounds, and she applied that capacity to the land with results that surprised Nathan and confirmed for Hector Vasquez what he had suspected, which was that the Sullivan land was more fertile than it appeared if the water management was right, and that a second irrigation channel on the eastern quarter would significantly expand what could be grown there. They dug the second channel in February, Nathan and Hector and Lillian side by side in the cold ground, and when the water moved through it in the early spring, they stood and watched it with the particular satisfaction of people who have made something work through the application of genuine effort, which is a satisfaction that has no equivalent in the world of parlors and polished silver. By March of 1883, it was clear that Lillian was expecting, a development she announced to Nathan on a Thursday evening with a directness that matched everything else about her, and he had sat very still for a moment, and then crossed the room and held her with a care and tenderness that had, beneath it, the complex emotion of a man who had not let himself want this, because he had not been sure he deserved it, and who was now allowing himself to want it with his full whole heart. The pregnancy went well. Lillian worked the land through spring and into summer with the practical determination of a woman who had not come west to be managed, modifying her physical work as necessary but not stopping it, much to the collective anxiety of Nathan and Mrs. Holcomb, who had formed an unofficial committee of concern that she found simultaneously touching and mildly irritating. Elena Vasquez was a calm and experienced presence during this time, having borne 3 children of her own, and her matter-of-fact knowledge was more useful to Lillian than any amount of careful masculine worry. In August of 1883, their son was born in the adobe house that Thomas Sullivan had built with his own hands on the hard ground of the Pecos Valley. He came at dawn, as the light was changing on the mesa, and Nathan was there through all of it, holding her hand and being spoken to sharply on 2 separate occasions and not flinching either time. And when the baby was finally in the room with them, red-faced and indignant at the shock of the world and entirely himself, Nathan held him with a focused reverence that made Lillian's throat close with love. They named him Thomas, for her father, with James as a middle name, for Nathan's father, and this combination of 2 dead men who had both broken themselves against good ground trying to build something real seemed to Lillian like exactly the right foundation for a new person. Thomas Carson arrived in the world in the same way his parents had come to the territory, without fanfare, without apology, with a complete and absolute intention to stay. The years that followed were layered and real, and full of the ordinary extraordinary texture of a life being built. Nathan expanded the cattle operation on his 80 acres, adding a small additional herd in the spring of 1884, after a favorable season gave them enough surplus to invest. Lillian's 60 acres, properly irrigated and carefully managed with Hector's experienced guidance, produced consistently enough that by 1885 they were not merely surviving but building, putting money away with the disciplined ambition of people who had learned not to take the land's generosity for granted. Thomas grew into a child of the desert, brown and quick and interested in everything, following his father across the land with the devoted attention of a small person who has identified the world's most interesting person and is not planning to let them out of sight. He had Nathan's direct dark eyes and Lillian's stubborn, precise way of asking questions that went straight to the heart of things, and watching the 2 of them together was one of the great ongoing pleasures of her days. There were difficulties. The territory was not a gentle place. A late frost in the spring of 1884 damaged the early crops and required them to replant at their own expense, which erased a season's careful savings. A dispute with a rancher named Birch from the next valley over, who had been gradually moving his fence line in a way that encroached on the Sullivan land's water rights, required a formal process through the county office that consumed 2 months of Nathan's time and a significant portion of their legal patience, and resulted in a settlement that was acceptable if not entirely satisfying. Hector's youngest child was sick through the winter of 1885 with a respiratory illness that frightened everyone, and Lillian and Elena sat up through several long nights together in the small house where the Vasquez family lived on the property, and the child recovered, but the experience left a mark of gratitude and deepened affection between the 2 families that would outlast many things. There was also the matter of the wider territory, which in the 1880s was in the complicated process of transitioning from frontier to organized administration, and this process was not always conducted with fairness. The Vasquez family's own history in the territory, Hector's family having lived in New Mexico for generations before it became American soil, was a layered story of dispossession and persistence that Lillian came to understand more fully as the years passed. There were land claims disputes that favored new Anglo settlers over established Mexican-American families. There were legal structures that made certain protections available to some and not to others, And there were moments when the injustice of this was entirely visible and entirely frustrating. Nathan and Lillian had occasion to speak plainly about this, and to act where they could. Their testimony in a land dispute that threatened a neighboring family in 1886 was one such occasion, a small act of decency in a landscape where decency was not always the default posture of the institutions involved. These things shaped them. The land, the work, the community, the injustices and the small remedies and the daily compound reality of a life built on genuine ground, all of it shaped them into people who knew who they were and why they had made the choices they had made. In the autumn of 1885, a letter came from Boston that carried different news than the usual updates. Her uncle had died, not suddenly but not peacefully, a long illness that her aunt described with the quiet accuracy of someone who had been watching it approach for months. He had not, in the end, entirely approved of Lillian's choices. But her aunt wrote that in his last weeks he had read Lillian's letters, the ones she sent every month or two describing the harvests and the land and Thomas's early steps and the quality of the winter light on the mesa, and he had said once that she had her father's spirit. Her aunt wrote that she believed he had meant it as the compliment it finally was. Lillian had read the letter in the late afternoon, sitting on the porch of the adobe house with Thomas asleep inside, and the mesa going its slow daily fire, and she had held the knowledge of her uncle's death and his reluctant blessing in the same space, and she had felt the particular compound emotion of someone who has grieved the impossibility of a thing, and then received a version of it too late and still somehow better than nothing. She wrote back a long letter to her aunt, longer than usual, and at the end she said, "I wish you would come visit. I know it is far. But I think you would understand, if you could stand on this ground and see what it is, why I never could have chosen otherwise." Her aunt did come, in the spring of 1886. The journey was long and difficult, and she arrived looking smaller than Lillian remembered, a compact woman of 62 in a good traveling coat, stepping down from the stage in Kiama Crossing with the expression of someone who has decided to be impressed rather than alarmed. Nathan met them at the stage and shook her aunt's hand with his straightforward courtesy, and her aunt, who had spent 50 years developing an unerring instinct for people, gave Lillian a look over his shoulder that said, clearly and without requiring a single word, "All right, I understand." Thomas had charmed her immediately and completely. He was nearly 3 and in full command of his own personality, which was considerable, and her aunt's Boston reserve had lasted approximately 10 minutes before Thomas had produced a small quartz rock from his pocket and placed it in her hand with the solemnity of a person bestowing treasure, and she had accepted it with equal solemnity, and the transaction had sealed something between them. Her aunt stayed for 3 weeks. She helped in the house and sat on the porch in the evenings, and talked with Nathan about cattle and land management, with the sharp interest of a woman who had run a family business for 30 years and understood the mechanics of endeavor. She walked the 60 acres with Lillian, slowly but without complaint, and Lillian showed her the irrigation channels and the crops coming up, and the place where her father had first broken ground, and the cottonwood trees along the creek that were older than anyone could account for, their roots deep in whatever water the desert kept hidden below. On the last evening before her aunt left, they sat together on the porch in the long spring light, and her aunt held Thomas in her lap, who was fighting sleep with the full commitment of a child who does not want to miss anything, and she said, "Your father knew something the rest of us didn't quite know. Not about the land, about you." She paused. "He knew you needed this, the reality of it, the difficulty. He knew you would make it mean something." Lillian had taken her aunt's hand and held it, and Thomas had finally surrendered to sleep between them, and the mesa had gone its colors, and Nathan had come out and stood in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and stopped when he saw the scene and simply waited, and Lillian had looked back at him, and something passed between them that was not a word or a gesture, but was everything, all of it, the whole accumulated weight of every choice she had made to be here. And she felt it settle into her like water settling into dry ground. Her aunt's visit left something behind. A new ease between Lillian and her past, perhaps, the sense that the life she had chosen and the life she had left were not in permanent opposition, that she could hold both without either canceling the other. She wrote more regularly to her aunt after that. The letters were warm and full, and her aunt's responses were too, and over the years a correspondence grew between them that was among the most satisfying relationships of Lillian's life. The spring of 1887 brought the kind of news that reshapes everything. There had been a proposal moving through territorial offices for a year or more, a railway spur that would extend the existing line 20 miles deeper into the valley, passing within 4 miles of the Carson properties. The confirmation of the route arrived in April, and Nathan came in from the land office with the document in his hands, and his face carrying an expression that she had learned to read as the face of a man who is calculating very fast. The railway meant market access. Not the uncertain trickle of trade they managed through the existing road connections, but real access, reliable access, the kind of connection to the wider economy that turned subsistence into commerce. It meant their cattle could reach buyers in Santa Fe and beyond without the punishing cost of long drives. It meant their crops could reach markets during the window when they were worth selling rather than after that window had passed. It meant everything they had been building could become viable in a way that was not just about surviving the present, but about building toward a future. It also meant they needed to act quickly, because the railway brought land speculators, and speculators were already beginning to appear at the edges of the valley, men with money and legal knowledge and the willingness to use both aggressively. Nathan and Lillian spent 2 weeks in April in the county seat, 30 miles away, working with a lawyer named Mr. Abuelos, a careful and principled man who had been practicing in the territory for 15 years, and who understood the particular legal vulnerabilities of small landholders in the face of organized capital, to ensure their deeds were utterly clean, their water rights formally documented, and their boundaries so clearly established in the public record that any challenge would require a determined investment of legal time to mount. This was not cheap. They spent money they had been saving for a cattle expansion and spent it without regret, because Lillian had grown up in a family that understood commerce, and she knew that the defensibility of a position is worth paying for before you need it rather than after. The speculator who came to them in May was a man named Aldridge, well-dressed and pleasant in the surface way of men who have learned that pleasantness is a more efficient tool than directness. He offered them a price for the Carson land, both properties, that was reasonable, and would have left them comfortable by the standards of the territory. He sat at their kitchen table and delivered the offer with the smooth confidence of a man who did not expect to be refused. Nathan declined. Aldridge recalibrated and offered more. Nathan declined again, not impolitely but with a finality that Lillian recognized and that Aldridge, being a professional at this, also recognized. He spent another 30 minutes exploring various alternatives and permutations and finally departed with his hat and his briefcase and the knowledge that he had encountered people who were not, in fact, for sale. After he left, Nathan sat at the table and looked at Lillian and said, "Are we certain?" "We're certain," she said. "We're not selling what we spent 5 years building." The offer was not bad money, he said, testing the question the way he always tested things, wanting to make sure the decision was genuinely made and not merely reflexive. "It was not," she agreed. "But money is not what we're here for, Nathan." He nodded, slowly and completely, and that was the end of the question. The railway came through the following year, in the spring of 1888, and the world changed in the way that railways changed worlds, which was quickly and thoroughly, and not without disruption. 3 new businesses opened in Kiama Crossing. A second boarding house appeared. A hardware store replaced the combination of improvised supply that people had been making do with. The population of the region grew by perhaps 40% in 2 years, which brought new neighbors, some of whom were welcome additions to the community, and some of whom were the kind of people who come to places for short-term extraction and leave when they've extracted what they came for. For Nathan and Lillian Carson, the railway was unambiguously transformative. The cattle operation expanded to a scale that, 4 years earlier, would have been impractical because there was nowhere to sell the animals at a price that justified the investment. Lillian's 60 acres, with Hector's management and the second irrigation channel producing full capacity, was now supplying vegetables and grain to buyers in Santa Fe through an arrangement she had negotiated directly, the first such arrangement in the valley, which earned her a reputation in the trading community that she found practically useful and personally satisfying in equal measure. Thomas was 5 when the railway came, old enough to understand that it was significant, and he had stood on the slight rise above the valley floor and watched the first engine come through with an expression of total absorption. And then he had turned to his father and asked, with the focused logic that was so entirely Lillian's, "Does it run every day?" And Nathan had said yes, and Thomas had said, "Then we should know the conductor." And Nathan had looked at Lillian over their son's head with an expression that was pure delight. The conductor's name was Mr. Ortega, and Thomas did, in fact, eventually know him, having embarked on a campaign of friendly persistence that lasted approximately 3 weeks and culminated in a personal tour of the locomotive, and a friendship that Thomas would maintain for years. In the summer of 1888, Lillian was expecting their second child, which she and Nathan had discussed and hoped for with the calm deliberateness of people who know what parenthood costs and want it anyway. She worked through the heat of summer with sensible adjustments. She had learned from Thomas's pregnancy what her body could manage and what it required, and in October, in the same adobe house where Thomas had been born, their daughter arrived. They named her Margaret for Lillian's aunt, with Rose as a middle name, because Lillian had been keeping a small rose bush alive on the south side of the house for 3 years against all odds, and when it finally bloomed that spring, she had taken it as a sign of something, though she would not have been able to say precisely what. Nathan had agreed to both names with the simple warmth of a man who understood that the naming of a child is a woman's gift to the generations, and he held Margaret Carson in his large, steady hands and looked at her with the same focused reverence with which he had held Thomas. And Lillian watched them and felt, again, the deep compound reality of the choice she had made, 6 years ago now, standing in her aunt's parlor with a letter smelling of lavender and money. Margaret was, from the beginning, a different sort of person than her brother. Where Thomas was focused and verbal and questioned everything out loud, Margaret was observant and physical, and spent her earliest years in a state of determined locomotion that kept everyone occupied. She walked early and climbed everything and had, from approximately 18 months onward, a relationship with the landscape that was more physical than analytical. She would pick up rocks and soil and put them in her mouth with a scientific thoroughness that alarmed and amused her parents in equal measure, and the ranch dogs, of which there were now 3, followed her with the dedicated attention of an honor guard that recognized a force of nature when it saw one. Nathan and Lillian had, by the early 1890s, built something that had dimension and history and the particular gravity of things that have survived difficulty. The 2 adjacent properties were run as a single operation in practice, generating enough income to be financially secure by the standards of the territory, with enough surplus to reinvest regularly and to contribute to the community in ways they both valued. They had helped fund the extension of the schoolhouse when the population increase made the original building inadequate. And Nathan sat on the informal council of ranchers that worked with the county office on water rights issues that affected the whole valley. The adobe house had been expanded twice, once when Thomas was 2 and once after Margaret's birth, And what had been her father's small four-wall structure was now a proper home with a real kitchen, and a covered porch on two sides, and a bedroom for each child, and a study where Lillian kept her records and her correspondence and her father's compass above the window that still looked east. She had kept the compass in that position deliberately, as a private acknowledgement of the journey she had made, the life she had left, and the life she had chosen. Boston existed in her with the clarity of something known and not denied. She understood what she had given up, the comfort and the certainty and the particular ease of a life that requires nothing difficult of you. She had given all of that up with full knowledge, and she had never, not once in all the years since, regretted the exchange. She had gotten dust and hard ground instead. She had gotten 60 acres of desert that had to be fought for every season. She had gotten calluses and sunburn and the kind of exhaustion that comes from work that is real rather than performed. She had gotten community and complexity, and the particular beauty of a landscape that was not soft but was true. She had gotten Thomas and Margaret, both of whom were the product of this particular hard ground, and could not have been anyone else anywhere else. And she had gotten Nathan Carson, who was working the land outside her window on this morning in the spring of 1892, a decade almost exactly after she had arrived on the stage from the East in her good traveling coat with $43 sewn into the lining. He was moving along the fence line at the northern edge, checking the posts with the same methodical care he brought to everything, and she could see him from where she sat at the kitchen table with her coffee, his hat dark against the bright sky, the easy, unhurried movement of a man completely at home in his own life. There were things she wanted to say to him that she said regularly, without embarrassment, because they were true and he deserved to hear them. There were things he said to her that she received with the simple acceptance of someone who had learned not to deflect what is genuine. They had 10 years between them now, and the love was different than it had been on the June evening when they had danced in the cold air, and she had told him about the irrigation channel. It was heavier and more dimensional, had corners and textures it had not had at the beginning, contained disagreement and exhaustion and grief, and the accumulated weight of real life. It was not romantic in the way that the word sometimes implies, something light and declarative and new. But it was romantic in the true sense. It was the thing beneath all the daily reality, the current that ran through the hard, ordinary life they had built, the reason the dust and the difficulty had value rather than merely weight. Every morning she woke up beside him and felt the warmth of that knowledge like a second sun. Every evening he came in from the land, and they sat at the table they had eaten at for a decade, and she felt the specific ease of being with the person who is the right person, which is a quiet joy but an absolute one. Thomas, who was nearly 9 and had the focused intelligence of someone who had been absorbing adult conversation since before he could speak, had asked her once why they had not gone to live in a city like some families he had heard about, where the work was different and the houses were bigger. She had sat with him at the kitchen table and thought carefully about how to answer, and then she said, "Because your grandfather came out here and found something true about this place, and I came out here to find it too, and your father was already here, already knowing it, and together we made it into something that is ours. The city might have been easier, but this is better." Thomas had considered this for a long moment with the expression of a person genuinely processing information, and then he said, "Is it better because it's hard?" And she said, "Partly, and partly because it's ours," and he nodded and went outside, and she heard the sound of his footsteps on the clay earth that was half her inheritance and half her life's work, and she felt something so complete and so sufficient that words would have been beside the point. Margaret was 4 and ruled the ranch dogs and could already identify 4 different species of cactus by name, a fact that Hector Vasquez regarded with the proprietary pride of someone who has contributed to her education. Alina had become as close as a sister over the years, the friendship between the two families one of the genuine gifts of the life Lillian had chosen. the easy, deep closeness of people who have worked and worried and celebrated alongside each other for long enough that the relationship has its own history and its own grammar. In the summer of 1892, Lillian received a letter from a publisher in St. Louis who had somehow encountered a series of letters she had written to her aunt, descriptions of the land and the work and the territory, which her aunt had apparently shared, with Lillian's permission implicitly assumed, a liberty Lillian found she could not quite be annoyed about, with a friend who knew someone in the publishing world, and the editor was writing to ask whether she had considered turning her observations into something formal. A record of the experience of a woman building a life on the frontier in the specific years of its transformation, from true wilderness to managed territory. She brought the letter to Nathan that evening and watched him read it and waited for his response. "Would you want to?" he asked when he finished. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I hadn't thought about it." "You write well," he said. "Your letters to your aunt, she reads them to me sometimes, you know, when you've described something particularly well. The way you wrote about the mesa last winter when we had the snow." He paused. "I think you should." She had started writing that autumn, at the desk in the study with the compass above the window, and the writing had surprised her with how much it wanted to come out, how much had been accumulating over 10 years of living a life that was not ordinary. She wrote about the land and the light and the difficulty of the irrigation and the particular beauty of the territory in different seasons. She wrote about the community and the railway and the speculator who had sat at her kitchen table and tried to buy what was not for sale. She wrote about her father and his letters and the compass that still looked east. She wrote with careful discretion but with honesty about the choices she had made and why she had made them. She did not write, in the version she sent to the publisher, the full interior truth of Nathan Carson, because some things belong to the life itself rather than the record of it. But she wrote enough that any careful reader would understand that the life she described was not a solitary achievement, but a shared one, built on a partnership that was equal in the truest sense of that word, which is not sameness but complementarity. Two people whose different natures fitted against each other in a way that made both of them larger than they had been alone. The publisher accepted the manuscript. The book came out in 1893, a slim volume with a plain cover, and it sold reasonably well in eastern cities where people were curious about the frontier in the way that people who have chosen safety are often curious about danger. And it sold, to Lillian's quiet pleasure, rather well in the territory itself, where people recognized the landscape and the community and the particular texture of a life that they were also living. Her aunt received the first copy and wrote a letter that was the best letter Lillian had ever received, 2 pages of unadorned feeling from a woman who did not often write without armor, ending with, "I have always known you were brave. I see now that you were also wise." The autumn of 1893 settled over the valley with the particular quality of autumns in the high desert, the light going gold and angular, and the nights beginning to carry real cold. Nathan and Lillian had taken a habit of evening walks along the northern fence line after supper, when the children were in bed, and the land had the quiet that it kept for after dark. They walked slowly in the manner of people who have walked the same ground many times and no longer need to look at their feet. And they talked in the easy way of people who have shared a life long enough that conversation is simply the continuation of a thought that began years ago. On one such evening in October, when the stars were thick above them and the mesa was a dark, solid shape against the sky, Nathan stopped walking and looked at the land around him. Their land, both properties, the combined result of 12 years of work, and weather and determination with an expression she had seen before but never quite like this, which was the expression of a man who is looking at what he has built and finding it, against his natural modesty, genuinely good. "Do you remember," he said, "what I said the first morning you came out to the property?" She thought for a moment. "You said it would take more than a morning's conversation." "And you said you had the rest of your life," he said. "I did," she said, "I'm glad," he said simply. "I'm glad you did." She took his hand in the dark, and they stood together on the hard ground of everything they had made. And the desert night was immense and silent around them, and the stars moved in their ancient paths above the mesa. And Lillian Sullivan Carson was exactly where she was supposed to be, which was here, on this ground with this man. And she had known it since the irrigation channel in the second week of May in 1882, and she knew it now with 11 years more weight behind it, and the knowledge only deepened, only grew truer, only settled more completely into the bedrock of herself. "I had the rest of my life," she said, "and I gave it to the right place." She felt his hand tighten around hers, and neither of them needed to say anything further. The years continued. Thomas turned 12 in 1895 and had developed an interest in engineering that Nathan encouraged and Lillian facilitated with textbooks ordered from Santa Fe and later from Boston. Because the territory's schools, while adequate for the basics, could not quite keep pace with the particular velocity of Thomas's curiosity. He spent hours with the irrigation systems, proposing modifications, some of which were impractical, and some of which Nathan quietly implemented because they were, in fact, better ideas than the ones currently in place. Margaret at 7 was a different kind of brilliant. She had her mother's eye for land and her own instinctive understanding of animals that was more sophisticated than anything her parents could explain, having taught her. The ranch dogs obeyed her completely, and the cattle responded to her with a docility that even Hector Vasquez, who had 30 years of experience with cattle, found impressive. She told her mother with the complete confidence of a 7-year-old who has already decided, to have the biggest ranch in the valley. Lillian had taken this aspiration entirely seriously. In the late spring of 1896, a final piece of the story settled into place in the form of a letter from her aunt in Boston, informing her that she was, at 68, not as spry as she had been, and that she had been advised by her doctor to consider a climate more forgiving than New England winters, and that she had been thinking, for some time, about whether the invitation Lillian had extended 10 years ago might still be open. The invitation was not merely still open. Lillian wrote back by return mail, or as close to return mail as the distance allowed, with a warmth that she hoped conveyed the true depth of her feeling, which was that she wanted her aunt in Kiama Crossing with the specific and powerful wanting of someone who has long accepted an absence and is unexpectedly offered its end. Her aunt arrived in September of 1896 on the railway line that had not existed when Lillian first came west, and she stepped off the train in Kiama Crossing, a town now of perhaps 300 souls, with a proper school and a small hotel, and 2 restaurants looking better than she had in years, the travel having suited her in a way that the life of careful social maintenance apparently had not. Thomas and Margaret were on the platform, Thomas at 13 already taller than his grandmother by adoption, and Margaret at 7 managing to be simultaneously dignified and vibrantly excited. And Aunt Margaret, whose name her niece had given to her granddaughter before she ever expected to meet her here, had looked at the child named for her, and smiled the deepest and most genuine smile Lillian had ever seen on that careful face. Nathan had built a small additional room onto the house the previous spring, after the invitation had been extended, and the possibility seemed real, and it was ready and comfortable, and looked out over the garden that Lillian had been cultivating for several years now, a determined project of color against the brown-red land, roses and lavender and yellow flowers whose names she had learned from Alina, so that the view from her aunt's window was green and blooming in the morning and golden in the afternoon. Her aunt settled in with the adaptive practicality of someone who had always been more capable of change than her circumstances had required her to demonstrate. She helped in the kitchen and took walks with Alina and played cards with Hector, and sat on the porch in the evenings watching Thomas work with Nathan on the fence line, and Margaret conduct her endless negotiations with the dogs. She was 70, and she moved carefully, but she was present in a way that Lillian had not dared to hope for, fully invested in the daily life of this household, this land, this world that was so entirely different from the one she had come from. At Christmas of 1896, the Carson house was full in a way it had never been. Nathan's mother had come down from Colorado for the holiday, a woman in her 60s named Catherine, spare and practical, and containing within her the same bedrock decency that was Nathan's most essential quality. Aunt Margaret and Catherine had found each other with the directness of two women of certain age who have both stopped being polite about their actual opinions, and had, within a single afternoon, arrived at a state of mutual respect that Lillian observed with delight. The children were overwhelmed with the richness of the occasion, and Thomas had given a small formal speech of welcome that had been prepared without anyone's knowledge, and was delivered with the solemnity of someone who understood that occasions have weight and deserve to be acknowledged, and everyone had laughed and applauded. And Nathan had looked at Lillian over Thomas's head, and she had looked back at him, and the house was full of warmth and the smell of food, and the sound of people who loved each other in the particular various ways that families assemble their love. And outside the desert night was cold and full of stars, and the mesa was a dark and faithful presence against the sky, as it had always been and would continue to be long after all of them were gone. But right now, in this moment, it was the backdrop of something that was entirely and specifically and irreplaceably theirs. Lillian stepped out onto the porch alone for a few minutes while the celebration continued inside, needing a moment with the vastness of the night and her own quiet mind. She stood on the hard clay ground her father had broken with his own hands and looked at the stars, and felt the cumulative weight of all the years and all the choices, and all the love that had accumulated in this place since she had first stood here at a broken gate with a map in her hand, and the stubborn certainty that this was where she belonged. She heard the door behind her and Nathan came out, not asking, just coming, the way he had always simply come when she needed company without having said so. He stood beside her and looked at the same sky she was looking at and said nothing. "I was thinking about the letter," she said after a while. "Which letter?" "The one my uncle wrote." "In the spring of 1882. The offer," she paused, "the apartment on Beacon Street." "What about it?" he asked. "I was thinking how close I came to accepting it," she said. "Not because I wanted to, but because it was the obvious thing, the expected thing, and there is a gravity to expected things." She paused again. "I'm glad I was stubborn enough to resist it." "I'm glad you were too," he said, with the quiet warmth of understatement that was so entirely him. "I got dust and hard ground," she said. "That's what my uncle called it in his postscript, dust and hard ground." "He wasn't wrong," Nathan said. "No," she agreed. "He wasn't." She reached out and took his hand and held it against the cold of the night. He just didn't understand what dust and hard ground could grow. Nathan looked at her, and his expression in the starlight was the same expression he had worn in the lantern light of the summer gathering in 1882, that unguarded, specific, entirely sincere joy. And she loved him now with the full weight of 14 years and 2 children and a book and 100 seasons, and all the difficult, beautiful, particular reality of the life they had made. Loved him in the way that is not fire but is warmth, not water but is depth. The steady, lasting, true kind of love that is the rarest thing that people manage to grow together on the hard ground of shared living. "Come inside," he said. "Your aunt is telling your mother stories about Boston, and I suspect at least half of them are somewhat embellished, and I think you should be there." She laughed, and the sound of it went out into the desert night and dissolved into the stars, and she went inside with him, back into the warm lit room full of the people she loved, and the door closed behind them on the cold and the dark and the magnificent open sky, and the mesa stood its faithful watch as it always had, and the irrigation channels ran their slow, purposeful water through the red earth. And the 60 acres that Thomas Sullivan had broken out of the desert, and his daughter had kept and built upon and given meaning, continued their quiet conversation with the seasons, growing things in the hard ground, in the dust, in the particular and irreplaceable beauty of a life that had been chosen freely and lived completely and loved without reservation. She had been offered ease. She had chosen this instead. She had chosen it every day for 14 years, and she would choose it every day for all the days that remained to her, and she would never, not once, not for a single turning moment, choose differently. And on the hard red ground of the Pecos Valley, in the last years of the 19th century, in a small adobe house that smelled of wood smoke and coffee, and the particular clean mineral scent of desert air, the Carson family gathered around their table, and the land was theirs, and the love was real, and it was enough. It was more than enough, it was everything.